Emily sat in the courtroom, her back straight, her fingers drumming impatiently on the cold surface of the table. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, the eyes of the jury focused on her, waiting for her to speak. She knew exactly how to command attention. She'd done it all her life. The expensive dress, the perfectly done makeup, and the confidence that only money could buy. She was untouchable. Before her sat 3 black security guards, stone-faced, their eyes fixed ahead. Emily couldn't help but sneer. They were beneath her, hired hands to protect her property, nothing more. They weren't her equals, certainly not in the way she had been raised to view the world. They didn't deserve to be in the same room, let alone challenge her in a legal setting. Her fingers clenched around her designer purse. She would win this case. There was no doubt. These men had overstepped their bounds, and her wealth, her power, would ensure her victory. The judge called the court to order, and Emily stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked to the podium. She glanced at her lawyer, who gave her a reassuring nod. This would be over quickly. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice smooth and polished, "I stand before you today because I have been wronged. These men," she gestured sharply toward the guards, "have violated my privacy and disrupted the peace in my home." She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, their attention fixed. The courtroom was silent except for her voice. She had them in the palm of her hand. They were hired to provide security, yet they refused to leave my property when asked. Not only that, but they threatened my guests and intimidated my staff. These men, she spat, have no respect for me or my property. They've caused irreparable harm to my reputation. They must be held accountable. Her voice grew louder, more forceful, as she looked at the guards, daring them to speak back. The tension in the room rose. She could see the faint flicker of irritation in their eyes, but they said nothing. The first guard, an older man with a thick beard, spoke up. His voice was calm, controlled. "Your Honor, I want to set the record straight. I wasn't there to harass anyone. We were there to do our job." Emily scoffed. "Your job?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're not some elite force. You're hired help, nothing more. I have every right to demand your removal." The guard didn't flinch. "We responded to a potential security threat. I don't think you understand what was happening. We weren't there for personal reasons." Emily's face flushed. How dare he challenge her? "You intimidated me, and that's something I will not tolerate." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. The second guard, a younger man, leaned forward. "We didn't threaten anyone. We did our job. You didn't like being told no, but that doesn't make us criminals." Her temper flared. "You're criminals in my eyes," she hissed. "People like you have no respect for anyone, let alone someone of my standing." The guard held her gaze, unshaken. "You're wrong," he said quietly but firmly. "We didn't disrespect you. We did our duty." Her heart began to race. She didn't like the way this was going. This wasn't supposed to be difficult. They were supposed to cower in front of her, apologize, and beg for mercy. But they weren't. They were standing their ground, and it unnerved her more than she cared to admit. The third guard, a tall man with a calm presence, stood up. His gaze was intense, unwavering. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "I think it's time you learned something about respect," he said, his voice low, yet commanding. Emily froze. The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a split second, she felt exposed, as if everything she believed in was being stripped away. "I think you should understand who you're speaking to," she snapped, trying to regain control. "I'm not someone you can dismiss so easily." The guard didn't react to her tone. Respect isn't about status or wealth. It's about understanding each other, treating people as they are, not how you think they should be. You've made a grave mistake, not just in your actions, but in how you view the world. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to shout back, but something held her back. There was something about his words, the calmness in his demeanor, that made her question everything she had believed up until now. "You think you can just walk all over us," the guard continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you don't know the first thing about us?" Emily felt a sudden chill. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what he meant. What could he possibly know that I don't? The judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Enough. We'll take a short recess." As the room began to buzz again, Emily sat back down, her fingers trembling slightly. The room felt smaller now, the weight of the guard's words lingering in her mind. They weren't the men she had expected them to be. They weren't just security guards. They were something more, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And in that moment, she realized something for the first time. She was no longer in control. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the brief recess. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her as the room slowly settled. She adjusted her designer's suit, a futile attempt to regain control. The words of the third guard, Marcus, still echoed in her mind. Respect isn't about status or wealth. She couldn't shake it. He had said something that struck deep, something she hadn't anticipated. She'd always been in control, always been the one to dictate the terms of her interactions. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt something unsettling, a feeling of being exposed, vulnerable. The guards were back in their seats, their expressions still unreadable as the first one, the older man, stepped up to testify. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tension building in Emily's chest. He had a quiet confidence that unnerved her. "I'm here because I did my job," the older guard began. His voice was measured, yet firm. "And my job was to protect. Not just her, but everyone in that house." Emily's fingers twitched involuntarily, and she exchanged a brief glance with her lawyer. He gave her an encouraging nod, but she wasn't sure it would be enough. The guard continued, detailing their actions that day, how they had followed standard security procedures, how Emily had ignored their warnings, how she had put everyone at risk. It was a narrative that didn't fit the picture she had carefully painted. They were there to ensure safety, the guard repeated. But they were also there to stop a potentially dangerous situation. Ms. Vanier was too busy protecting her image to see the bigger picture. Emily's chest tightened. Her hands clenched around the armrests of her chair. Dangerous situation? She couldn't believe it. How could they paint her as the villain when she was the one wronged? But there was something about his tone that made it hard to refute. His words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The second guard, the younger one, stood next. He wasn't as polished in his delivery, but his words were no less impactful. He spoke about how Emily had disregarded their authority, how she had tried to push them out of her home when they were simply doing their duty. "We weren't just protecting her," he said, glancing at Emily. "We were protecting everyone who was in that house. And I'm sorry, but she was too arrogant to understand that." Emily flinched, her face flushing with embarrassment. She had never thought of herself as arrogant, at least, not in the way they were describing her. But the way they spoke, with such certainty, made her feel as though her entire life had been a lie. It was as if everything she had built was crumbling before her eyes. Then, Marcus stood. He was the last of the three guards to testify, and the tension in the room seemed to intensify the moment he spoke. His calm presence filled the room, and Emily could feel the weight of his gaze on her, unwavering, like a force of nature. "My name is Marcus Haynes," he began, his voice strong but measured. "I've been in this line of work for over 20 years. I've seen everything, from the chaos of war zones to the quiet of high-end estates. But there's one thing I've learned over the years: respect is earned." Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He wasn't speaking in the way she expected him to. There was no anger, no outrage. Just calm, unwavering confidence. "Respect isn't about how much money you have or what your title is," Marcus continued, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's about how you treat people, no matter their background or job. The people you look down on, the ones you think are beneath you, they are just as deserving of respect as you are." The room seemed to go silent. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily's heart raced, but she couldn't look away. Marcus's gaze was unyielding. She had no idea how to respond. "It's easy to look at people like us, the security guards, the help, and think we're disposable," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "But we're not. We're people just like you. And when you disregard that, when you treat others like they don't matter, there are consequences." Emily's mind spun. She had always seen herself as above it all. She had always believed that money, status, and power could shield her from the consequences of her actions. But here, in this room, with these three men, her worldview was being shattered. "Do you think," Marcus asked, his voice rising, "that you can just push us around? That your money will get you out of every situation? You don't control everything, Ms. Vanier. And today, you're going to learn that the hard way." The room was still. Emily's throat tightened, and for the first time, she felt small. She had always been the one in charge, the one who decided what happened. But now, it was as if her entire world had shifted on its axis, and she was suddenly powerless. Her lawyer leaned in, his voice urgent but low. "Emily, you need to stay calm. We have to keep this together." But how could she? How could she keep her composure when everything she believed in was being torn apart by a man she had once thought beneath her? "I did my job," Marcus finished, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I will stand by it." As he returned to his seat, the room felt heavier than before. The jury was silent, their eyes flicking between Emily and the guards. She could feel the shift in the air. She could feel them turning against her. Her grip on the armrest tightened as panic began to rise within her. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the end of the testimony. "We'll adjourn for the day. Closing arguments tomorrow." Emily stood, her legs shaking. The courtroom was a blur as she walked out, her lawyer beside her, but she hardly heard his words. Her mind was spinning. The walls she had carefully built around herself, her money, her status, her control, had all come crashing down in the span of a few hours. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady her nerves, but her thoughts were racing. What just happened? She had underestimated them. She had thought they were nothing more than hired help, beneath her, disposable. But now, she could feel it, they were more than that. And for the first time in her life, Emily Vanier didn't know if she could win this. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The air was thicker, charged with an electric tension that made Emily's skin crawl. She sat in her seat, her fingers drumming nervously on the wooden armrest, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. The words of Marcus, the tall guard with the unyielding gaze, replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. Respect is earned, not given. It was all she could think about. Her lawyer, Mr. Fitzgerald, sat beside her, whispering reassurances in her ear. "We've got this, Emily. Stay focused. Just stick to the facts. They can't beat the evidence we've gathered." But Emily wasn't sure anymore. The guards, especially Marcus, had gotten under her skin in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't used to feeling like this, so vulnerable, so unsure. She had always been in control, always had the upper hand. But now, with every word they spoke, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings were about to begin. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she straightened her posture, trying to appear confident. She forced herself to meet the eyes of the jury, but they didn't look at her the way they had before. There was a new wariness in their eyes, a doubt that had not been there on the first day of the trial. She could feel it in the way they glanced at her, the way they avoided her gaze when she caught them looking. The first to speak that day was Marcus. He walked to the witness stand with the same calm, deliberate pace as before. His presence filled the room, and for a brief moment, Emily felt the weight of his gaze again. He looked at her, not with anger or judgment, but with something she couldn't quite place. His eyes were calm, but they held a challenge. It was as if he was daring her to prove him wrong, to somehow show him that she wasn't the person he thought she was. He took the oath, then turned his attention back to the judge. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and unwavering. "We did what we had to do to ensure the safety of everyone involved. I understand that Ms. Vanier may feel differently about the situation, but we were simply following protocol. We responded to the call, and we did our jobs." Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. This wasn't the dramatic testimony she had expected. There was no bombshell, no emotional outburst. It was just calm, factual, and precise, like he had been trained for this his entire life. The younger guard took the stand next, his testimony much the same. He didn't dwell on emotions or the personal side of things. He didn't paint Emily as the villain, but he didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. It was clear. They were both professionals, calm, measured, and resolute in their stance. And the more they spoke, the more Emily's defense began to crumble. Her lawyer tried to counter their testimony, poking holes in their story, attempting to discredit their words. But there was a quiet strength in what they were saying. The evidence they presented painted a picture that wasn't as simple as Emily had believed. The tension in the room mounted as Marcus was called back to the stand. This time, Emily could no longer hold back. Her voice was sharp as she addressed him directly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound composed. "Why are you making me out to be the bad guy? You were just hired help. You were supposed to protect the property, not lecture me about my life." The words were out before she could stop them, and the room seemed to hold its breath. She looked at Marcus, expecting anger or defiance, but instead, there was something else in his eyes. Something that made her stomach twist, pity. He leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't understand, do you?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. "It's not about your property. It's not about your wealth. It's about respect. You've built your life on looking down on people like me. People like my team. You think you're untouchable. But no one is untouchable, Emily." Her breath caught in her throat. His words stung, and for the first time, she felt exposed, like a mask she had worn for years had been ripped away in front of everyone. She wasn't untouchable. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as above it all as she had always believed. "I never wanted this," Marcus continued. "I didn't want to be here, doing this. But your actions left me with no choice. We're not your enemies, Emily. But you've made us out to be." Emily's pulse raced, her hands sweating as she struggled to find a response. She wasn't used to being challenged in this way. She wasn't used to someone looking at her as if they could see right through her, as if they knew the truth that she had kept hidden from everyone, even herself. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, looking at Emily with a mixture of concern and frustration. "You can't let him manipulate you, Emily. Focus." But it was too late. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were crumbling, piece by piece. The more Marcus spoke, the more Emily began to realize something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. Maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe she wasn't the person she had always believed herself to be. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with tension. The jury was watching her, their eyes flicking between her and Marcus. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a battleground, and Emily felt like the ground beneath her feet was giving way. As Marcus finished his testimony, he turned to face her one last time. "I don't expect you to understand today, Emily. But I hope, someday, you'll realize that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you have to earn." The words hit her like a physical blow. He was right. She had never earned respect. She had only demanded it, taken it for granted. And now, in front of the judge, the jury, and the guards who had become her unexpected adversaries, she saw the truth. The courtroom was silent as Marcus left the stand, his words still hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Emily's mind raced, the weight of everything he had said settling deep in her chest. She had no idea what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was in control anymore. Her life, the one she had so carefully constructed, was starting to unravel. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft scratching of pens on legal pads and the occasional shuffle of feet. Emily could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the weight of their gaze more oppressive than ever. The events of the past few days were becoming a blur, a haze of uncertainty and dread. But what remained clear was this: she wasn't in control anymore. Her lawyer, Mr. Fitzgerald, had been trying to rebuild their case, pushing back against the guards' testimonies. But Emily could see the cracks forming in his facade. He was losing confidence, and so was she. The words of Marcus, the way they had pierced her armor, echoed in her mind over and over again. Respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you have to earn. She couldn't escape them. The guards, with their calm, measured words, had shattered everything she had believed about her power, about her privilege. They had turned her world upside down, and now she was facing the consequences. The gavel struck the desk, signaling the beginning of the day's session. The judge's stern voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the room. "We will proceed with the closing arguments. Mr. Fitzgerald, you may begin." Emily's lawyer stood, smoothing his tie as he stepped up to the podium. She watched him with a detached sense of hopelessness. He had been the one to guide her through this entire process, but now, even his words seemed to lack conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mr. Fitzgerald began, his voice faltering slightly, "we've heard the testimonies of the defendants, but let's not forget the facts. The evidence we've presented shows clearly that Ms. Vanier had every right to act as she did. She was in her own home, following the rules she set for her property." Emily wanted to believe in his words. She wanted to hold on to the illusion that she could still win this, that her wealth and status could somehow turn the tide in her favor. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she had been avoiding. It wasn't enough anymore. Her lawyer continued to speak, but his words blurred together. Her mind was elsewhere. She thought back to Marcus's testimony, the way he had looked at her, the way his words had cut through her defenses. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't been vindictive. He had been calm, almost compassionate in his rebuke. And now she realized she was beginning to understand. The walls she had built around herself, The barriers she had put in place to shield herself from the truth were beginning to crumble. The prosecutor, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a cold demeanor, stood next to the podium. Her briefcase clicked open with a sharp snap as she prepared to deliver her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, her voice firm and commanding, "what we've witnessed here is a display of privilege, of entitlement, of a woman who believes that the rules do not apply to her. Ms. Vanier's actions that day were reckless, dangerous, and entirely out of line." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The prosecutor was right. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she had considered the consequences of her behavior. She had thought she was above it all, above the rules, above the law. But now, the reality of the situation was settling in. She had pushed people around, dismissed their authority, and treated them like they didn't matter. And in doing so, she had built her own downfall. Ms. Vanier's behavior was not just an isolated incident, the prosecutor continued. It was a pattern of disregard for the safety and well-being of those around her. She has consistently shown a lack of respect for others, and now she must face the consequences of her actions. Emily's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She wanted to scream, to argue, to defend herself. But the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she defend herself when everything the prosecutor said was true? She had been reckless. She had been careless. And now her empire was crumbling. The prosecutor's gaze swept over the jury, and Emily could feel the weight of her words settling on the room. The jury was listening, absorbing every word. She could see the doubt in their eyes now, the doubt that hadn't been there when the trial began. The prosecutor turned her attention back to Emily. Ms. Vanier has had every opportunity to learn from her mistakes, but she continues to deflect blame and play the victim. The only thing she has shown is that she is willing to sacrifice others to protect her own reputation. The prosecutor's words hit Emily like a slap. The truth was undeniable now. She had always been so focused on her image, her reputation, her status that she had failed to see the damage she was causing. She had treated people as tools, as stepping stones on her path to success, and now she was paying the price. The room fell into an eerie silence as the prosecutor finished her argument. The jury's eyes were fixed on Emily, and she could feel the weight of their judgment. She wanted to look away, to hide, but she couldn't. She couldn't escape the truth anymore. The gavel came down again, signaling the end of the arguments. The judge stood, his gaze sweeping across the room. The jury will now deliberate. Emily's heart was racing as she stood, her knees weak beneath her. She walked out of the courtroom with Fitzgerald at her side, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's words. "You think you're untouchable, but no one is untouchable." She had been untouchable for so long. She had built her life on the belief that money and status could protect her from the consequences of her actions. But now, she was faced with the reality that she was no different from anyone else. She wasn't immune to the consequences of her choices. As she stepped into the hallway, her lawyer spoke, his voice low. "Emily, you need to prepare yourself. The jury's deliberation could take hours, but we need to be ready for whatever comes." She nodded numbly, but her mind was still racing. There was no going back. The damage was done. And as much as she wanted to believe she could still win this, a part of her knew that the consequences were already in motion. The reckoning had begun. Emily sat in her luxurious office, staring out the window, where clouds and city lights reflected off the glass. The events of the past day were a blur, a whirlwind of discussions, statements, and the final moments in the courtroom. Now she had to make a decision. Tomorrow was the day the verdict would be read, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had already paid too high a price for her actions. The last words of Marcus, the very guard she had despised and resisted so much, continued to echo in her mind. You can be rich, but that doesn't mean you're above everyone else. You don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by giving it. She didn't understand why his words had cut so deep. Why did he, of all people, manage to pierce through her defenses and make her feel vulnerable? For so many years, she had judged people based on their appearance and social standing. How foolish. You understand the court will likely rule against you, right? Her lawyer's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to him, trying to gather her composure. Yes, I understand, she replied, her voice faltering slightly. But deep down, Emily realized it wasn't just about the court's ruling anymore. The real issue was within herself. It took her some time to process it, but now it was clear. She needed to change. She needed to reevaluate her views on people, on the world around her, and maybe even her place in it. This realization didn't come overnight. She had tried to justify herself, thinking that her behavior was a result of her upbringing, the environment she grew up in. But when she thought back to Marcus's testimony, the calm but firm confidence in his words, her world was turned upside down. Through several days of reflection, Emily began to see the truth she had long avoided. Her behavior, her arrogance, her dismissiveness toward others, it had all been a defense mechanism, an illusion to protect her from the reality she never wanted to face. Then, a few days after the trial, as her lawyers and assistants worked on the details, Emily decided to do something that once seemed impossible. She dialed a number she remembered from the trial, the number Marcus had left with her. He wasn't on duty at that moment, but he called her back within minutes. Emily? His voice was calm, but with a hint of cautiousness. Marcus, I want to talk, she said, feeling her nerves steadied with each word. I realize how wrong I was. I want to apologize for everything I said, for the way I treated you and your colleagues. I'm ashamed of my actions. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Emily felt her heart race. Had he processed her words? Was he, like she once did, skeptical of the sincerity behind them? Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice soft but respectful. I appreciate that you are acknowledging your mistakes, Emily. I know it wasn't easy for you to say that, but what matters now is not just what you say. It's what you do next. It's how you'll change your actions going forward. Emily sighed, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. I'm ready to change, Marcus. I want to help others, to work on myself and never again allow prejudices to dictate my actions. I can't undo what I've done, but I can start with myself. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, his words carrying an air of understanding. That's good. I believe you can do it. Just remember, the real test will come when things get tough. Don't walk away from this path. Then, Emily knew it wasn't just her who was changing. The world around her was beginning to shift as well. Her relationships with people, those she once considered insignificant, were transforming. She began to see things from a new perspective, to view others with respect, not as tools or objects for personal gain. She felt that she was truly growing, not just professionally, but as a person, someone who now understood the importance of respect and sincerity. In the days that followed, Emily dedicated herself to charitable projects focused on supporting people from all walks of life. She strove to be an example of someone who had learned and evolved. The lessons she had learned were hard-earned, but they had changed her. When the court announced its ruling, it wasn't as harsh as expected. Perhaps it was due to her sincere apology and her commitment to change. But for Emily, the verdict didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was that she had realized a greater truth, that respect for others wasn't determined by their social standing, skin color, or financial status. It was determined by her ability to be open, honest, and fair. And that realization was her true victory.